Mechanic fixes the billionaire daughter car, and what happened next left the mechanic in tears. When a silver Ferrari worth more than most houses rolled into the Red District on a rain-soaked Tuesday night, the working girls knew exactly what it meant. Another rich boy slumming it before his real life swallowed him whole. But Steve Sterling wasn't looking for salvation or a story to tell his friends over cigars. He was looking for oblivion. One last night before tomorrow's board meeting chained him to a merger marriage and a destiny written by corporate lawyers. Then he saw her, Ruby, leaning against graffiti-covered brick with eyes that didn't beg or flirt, just calculated. She looked like she could gut a man 6 different ways, and Steve, heir to a tech empire he never wanted, was about to discover she could do something far more dangerous. She could make him feel something real. Before we get into the main story, let me know in the comments section where you are watching from. Subscribe and share because I have more interesting stories to share with you. The asphalt shimmered under a brutal midday sun, reflecting the heat back onto Rose as she paced beside her stalled Ferrari. The car was a masterpiece of Italian engineering, a Rosso Corsa streak against the drab highway, now rendered a useless hunk of metal. When the sound of a sputtering engine broke the silence, she looked up, expecting a high-end rescue team. Instead, a rusted oil-stained tow truck clattered to a halt behind her. Walsh stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. He looked like he was made of iron and road dust, his face smudged with old grease. Rose didn't wait for him to speak. "You have got to be kidding me," she snapped, gesturing to his truck. "I called for professional assistance, not a scrap metal collector. Do you even know how to open the hood on a car that costs more than your life?" Walsh didn't flinch at the venom in her voice. He didn't even look at her. He walked to the front of the Ferrari, his eyes scanning the chassis with a clinical precision that didn't match his rugged exterior. "The car's fine," he said, his voice a low, gravelly hum. "It's the person who touched it last that's the problem." "Excuse me." Rose stepped into his space, the scent of her expensive perfume clashing with the salt and gasoline emanating from him. "I am Rose Titan. This car was serviced by the best engineers in the country this morning. It's a mechanical failure. Just hook it up and try not to scratch the paint." Walsh ignored her, reaching into the engine bay. His large, calloused hands moved with the delicacy of a pianist. He pulled a small, black cylindrical device no larger than a thumb drive from behind the electronic control unit. He held it up between 2 grease-stained fingers. "A mechanical failure doesn't come with a remote-activated kill switch, Miss Titan," Walsh said, his eyes finally meeting hers. The cold intelligence in his gaze stopped her breath. "This isn't a breakdown. It's an assassination attempt. This device was set to cut your power and lock your steering precisely 4 miles ahead, right at the Devil's Peak hairpin turn." Rose felt the blood drain from her face. She looked from the tiny black device to the sheer cliffs in the distance. The arrogance she had worn like armor shattered. "You're lying," she whispered, though her heart hammered against her ribs in terror. "Who are you?" "I'm the guy who just saved you from a long walk off a short cliff," Walsh replied, turning back to the engine. He bypassed the secondary sensor in seconds, and the Ferrari roared to life with a predatory growl. He stepped back, wiping his hands on a rag that was cleaner than his truck. "Drive slow, Rose. Your engineers aren't the only ones with a key to your life." As he climbed back into his rusted cab, Rose stood frozen, the heat of the purring engine at her back and the chilling truth of his words sinking in. The grease monkey hadn't just fixed her car. He had seen through a conspiracy her family's billion-dollar security team had missed. Rose watched the rusted tow truck pull away, the sound of its rattling engine a stark contrast to the smooth, dangerous hum of her Ferrari. Her heart was still hammering against her ribs, the weight of the sabotaged chip in her palm feeling heavier than lead. She was a Titan, raised in a world where every problem had a price tag and every person had a quote. To her, Walsh was a variable she needed to control, an anomaly that knew too much and possessed skills that shouldn't belong to a man in grease-stained coveralls. She caught up to him at a dusty gas station 3 miles down the road. Walsh was leaning against his truck, cleaning his spectacles with a surprisingly white handkerchief. He didn't look up as the Ferrari screeched to a halt beside him. "I don't like being left behind," Rose said, stepping out of the car. Her voice was steadier now, the icy composure of a billionaire's daughter returning. She reached into her Hermes bag and pulled out a checkbook, scribbling a figure with a gold-nibbed pen. She tore the slip of paper off and held it out to him. $100,000. Consider it a tip for the roadside assistance and a retainer for your silence. I want you to come work for Titan Motors. Private security, lead engineering, name your title. Walsh finally looked at her, his gaze sweeping over the check before landing on her face. He didn't reach for the paper. Instead, he let out a short, dry laugh that sounded like grinding gears. You Titans are all the same, he said, his voice devoid of warmth. You think you can buy the truth just to bury it under a pile of cash. I don't want your money, Rose. I've seen what Titan money does to people's souls. Rose flinched, the check trembling in her hand. You saved my life, Walsh. Whether you like it or not, you're involved. If they tried to kill me today, they'll try again tomorrow. I have a board of directors filled with vipers and a security team that is clearly compromised. I need someone who isn't on their payroll. Walsh looked toward the horizon, his jaw tight. He hated that he cared. He hated that the engineering in that car screamed of a betrayal he recognized all too well. Keep your check, he said, walking toward his truck. I won't be your employee, but I'll help you find the mole. Not for the company, and not for the money. He paused at the door, looking back at her with a haunted intensity. I'll do it because the person who put that chip in your car is the same person who destroyed my life 10 years ago. We're hunting the same ghost, Rose. Just don't expect me to bow when you sign the checks. As he climbed into the cab, Rose slowly crumpled the six-figure check into a ball. She realized then that Walsh wasn't someone she could own. He was the only man she could actually trust. The scent of iron filings, old oil, and high-octane fuel hung heavy in the air of the cramped garage. Rose stepped cautiously over a discarded camshaft, her designer heels clicking rhythmically against the oil-stained concrete. The space was a far cry from the sterile white-tiled laboratories of Titan Motor Group, yet as she moved deeper into Walsh's sanctuary, she felt a strange magnetic pull. This wasn't just a repair shop, it was a cathedral of mechanical intent. Walsh was hunched over a workbench, the orange glow of a desk lamp illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He didn't turn around as she approached, his hands busy polishing a turbine blade with a focus that bordered on the religious. Rose's eyes wandered to the far wall, where massive sheets of drafting paper were pinned haphazardly over grease-streaked windows. She moved closer, her breath catching as she traced the intricate lines of the blueprints. The designs were impossible. She saw schematics for a variable compression combustion chamber that solved the thermal efficiency paradox her family's team had been struggling with for a decade. Beside it was a layout for an electromagnetic drivetrain that defied every current patent in the industry. These weren't the sketches of a roadside mechanic. They were the visions of a man who looked at physics and saw suggestions rather than laws. These fuel injectors, Rose whispered, her fingers hovering just inches from the paper. They're designed to pulse at a frequency that matches the piston's harmonic resonance. No one has ever successfully modeled this outside of a theoretical simulation. It works, Walsh said, finally setting his tool down. He turned, the shadows casting his eyes into deep pits of steel. If you know how to talk to the metal, it listens. Rose felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty garage. She remembered a night years ago, standing outside her father's study, hearing him whisper in a terrified, respectful tone about a ghost engineer, a prodigy who had vanished after a boardroom coup, taking the future of the industry with him. Her father had spent millions trying to find the man who had outthought 1,000 PhDs. My father called you a myth, Rose said, her voice trembling as she looked back at Walsh. He said you were the only man who ever made him feel like an amateur. You're the architect of the Titan X prototype. You're the reason my family's empire even exists. Walsh walked toward her, the light catching the silver scars on his knuckles. Your father's empire was built on the ashes of my reputation, Rose. I didn't vanish. I was buried. The silence that followed was heavy with a decade of unspoken history. Rose looked at the blueprints and then at the man in the dirty coveralls, realizing that the genius her family had tried to erase was the only person who could now save her from their own legacy. In this grease-stained kingdom, she wasn't the billionaire heiress. She was a student standing before a master who had every reason to hate her. The grand ballroom of the Titan estate was a shimmering cage of crystal chandeliers and whispered treachery. Rose walked with her head held high, her hand resting on the sleeve of a suit that clearly didn't belong here. Walsh looked stiff, the cheap polyester of his jacket catching the light in all the wrong ways, his presence a dark smudge against the sea of silk and tuxedos. He didn't belong, and the elite knew it. "Is this the new direction for Titan Motors, Rose?" a silver-haired board member sneered, circling them like a shark. "Picking up charity cases from the roadside? I hope he didn't bring the smell of diesel into the buffet." A ripple of cruel laughter followed them through the hall. Rose gripped Walsh's arm tighter, her eyes flashing, but Walsh remained a statue of calm. He wasn't looking at the guests. He was looking at the flickering of the recessed lighting and the slight hum vibrating through the floorboards. "Your harmonics are off," Walsh whispered to Rose, ignoring the insults thrown his way. "The building's load balancer is struggling with the new holographic display in the lobby. Someone overcharged the grid." Before Rose could respond, the world went black. A collective gasp rose from the crowd as the music died and the emergency lights failed to kick in. The ballroom was plunged into a terrifying, absolute darkness. Security teams scrambled, their flashlights dancing frantically, but the high-tech backup systems remained silent. In the shadows, panicked voices began to rise. The board members were suddenly vulnerable, and the prestigious event was turning into a public relations disaster. "Get out of the way," the lead engineer shouted, shoving past Rose with a tablet that refused to boot. "The main breaker is fused. It's a total system collapse. We need hours to bypass the core." Walsh didn't ask for permission. He stepped toward the gilded service panel behind the stage, his movements fluid and certain in the dark. With a pocket knife he'd kept hidden, he stripped a set of redundant wires, his fingers moving with a speed that defied the gloom. He wasn't just fixing a circuit, he was performing surgery on the building's nervous system. "Don't touch that, you idiot. You'll fry the entire," the engineer started, but he was cut short by a hum of pure, stable power. The light surged back to life, not with a flicker, but with a brilliant, steady glow. The holographic displays stabilized, and the air conditioning kicked back in with a soft purr. The room fell silent as the elite looked from the restored grandeur to the man in the cheap suit standing by the panel. Walsh wiped a smudge of copper dust from his thumb and stepped back toward Rose, his expression unchanged. The lead engineer stared at the panel in disbelief. That bypass is impossible. That's a theoretical bridge." Rose looked at the board members, their mouths still agape, and then at Walsh. For the first time, the humiliation didn't belong to the mechanic, it belonged to the empire that thought it could survive without him. She realized then that while they owned the gold, Walsh owned the light. The sun glinted off the sleek, aerodynamic curves of the Titan Helios, the company's most ambitious prototype in a generation. It was a vehicle that promised to revolutionize autonomous travel, and the world's press was gathered at the track to see it perform. Rose stood on the podium, her heart swelling with a pride she hadn't felt in years, until the demonstration began. The Helios surged forward, but 50 yards in, the engine began to scream with a high-pitched, metallic whine. The car lurched violently, its steering locking as it veered toward the reinforced glass of the viewing gallery. A panicked silence gripped the crowd as the car screeched to a halt just inches from the front row. Before Rose could even speak, Victor Vane, the CEO of a rival conglomerate, stepped into the light of the cameras. "Is this the genius you've been hiding, Rose?" he asked, his voice dripping with mock concern. "Your miracle mechanic has built a death trap. This isn't engineering, it's negligence." He held up a tablet, showing a falsified diagnostic report that pointed directly to Walsh's manual overrides as the cause of the failure. The reporters swarmed, their flashes strobing like lightning. Walsh stood at the edge of the track, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He didn't look like a man under pressure, he looked like a man watching a very simple puzzle. As security moved to escort him away, he stepped toward the Helios. "I wouldn't touch that if I were you," Vane sneered. "You've done enough damage." Walsh ignored him, reaching into his jacket and pulling out a ruggedized tablet. He plugged a physical bypass cable into the car's external data port. "The mechanical systems are perfect," Walsh said, his voice carrying over the speakers as the audio-visual team struggled to keep up. "What you're seeing is a logic bomb. A Trojan horse hidden in the collision avoidance subroutine." With a flick of his wrist, Walsh mirrored his screen onto the massive stadium displays. The crowd gasped as lines of scrolling green code appeared, hundreds of thousands of strings moving at a speed no human should be able to read. "There," Walsh pointed. A block of red code was pulsing, overriding the braking sequence. That's a remote access signature. It originated from a server in this very building 10 minutes ago. His fingers danced across the screen, a blur of motion that looked more like music than typing. He wasn't just fixing the error, he was rewriting the entire kernel. In 60 seconds, the red code turned blue, then vanished. "The car is clean," Walsh announced. "And I've rerouted the hack's origin. Security might want to check Mr. Vane's private suite for the transmitter." The Helios purred back to life, its engine note now a flawless, humming song. It pulled away autonomously, navigating a complex obstacle course with surgical precision. The press turned their cameras away from the car and toward a pale, stuttering Victor Vane. Rose looked at Walsh, who was already disconnecting his cable, looking as bored as if he'd just changed a tire. She realized then that Walsh didn't just understand machines. He was the ghost in them, and heaven help anyone who tried to haunt his territory. The victory over Vane should have felt like a triumph, but the silence in Rose's private office was suffocating. Walsh had retreated to his garage, leaving behind the ruggedized tablet he'd used at the track. It sat on her mahogany desk, a cold piece of metal that felt like a ticking bomb. Rose shouldn't have looked. She told herself she was just looking for the encryption logs from the hack, but her fingers drifted toward the deep system archives, the files Walsh had recovered from the old Titan servers. Deep within a folder marked Legacy Termination, she found a scanned document from a decade ago. It was a formal exit agreement, stripped of all legal jargon and reduced to a single, brutal sentence that barred Walsh from the industry for life. But it wasn't the text that made the air vanish from her lungs. It was the signature at the bottom. The ink was thick, confident, and unmistakably her father's. For years, Rose had lived under the narrative that Walsh had simply disappeared, a flighty genius who couldn't handle the pressure. Her father had played the grieving mentor, lamenting the loss of a son. Now, the truth stared back at her in a jagged scrawl. Her father hadn't lost Walsh, he had liquidated him. He had stolen the Titan X patents, slapped a non-disclosure agreement on the man who built them, and tossed him into the gutter to ensure the Titan family alone wore the crown of innovation. The door creaked open, and Walsh stood there, his silhouette framed by the hallway light. He didn't look angry when he saw the document on her screen. He looked tired. "I wondered if you'd find that," he said softly. "I wanted to believe you were different, Rose. I wanted to believe you didn't have his blood in your veins." "I didn't know," Rose whispered, her voice cracking. "I swear to you, I thought you left us." "He didn't just fire me, Rose. He erased me. He called every garage, every lab, and every investor in 3 states to make sure I couldn't even get a job sweeping floors." Walsh stepped into the room, his presence suddenly looming and cold. "Every time I looked at you these past weeks, I saw his eyes. I saw the legacy of a man who builds empires by destroying people. The trust that had been carefully forged over grease-stained blueprints and midnight rescues shattered in the span of a heartbeat." Rose reached out to him, but Walsh recoiled as if her touch were a contagion. The gratitude she felt for her life, the burgeoning affection she had for the man who saved her, it all felt like a lie. She wasn't his partner, she was the daughter of his executioner. "Walsh, please, let me make it right," she begged. "You can't fix a broken soul like you fix an engine, Rose," he replied, turning toward the door. "Some things stay wrecked." As he walked out, leaving her alone with her father's sins, Rose realized that the engine of their alliance had finally seized, and no amount of genius could restart it. The betrayal of the signature had left a hollow ache in the center of the Titan estate, but for the board of directors, there was no room for sentiment. They had watched Walsh dismantle their sabotage and bypass their security with the ease of a god, and they knew that as long as he breathed, their grip on the company was slipping. They didn't need a mechanic anymore, they needed a hostage. Rose was leaving the headquarters late, her mind a blurred reel of her father's lies, when the shadows in the parking garage moved. She didn't even have time to scream before a heavy, chemically scented cloth was pressed over her mouth. The world swirled into darkness. When she woke, the air was cold and smelled of rusted iron and stagnant water. She was bound to a chair in the center of the old Titan manufacturing plant, the very place where Walsh's career had been executed a decade ago. It was a graveyard of abandoned assembly lines and skeletal machinery, a fitting place for a final reckoning. Her phone, sitting on a crate just out of reach, vibrated. The screen illuminated the face of the board's chairman, a man who had once bounced Rose on his knee. He wasn't calling her, He was using her phone to broadcast a video feed to the one person they knew would come. Miles away, in his dim garage, Walsh's monitors flickered to life. He saw Rose, pale and defiant despite the ropes cutting into her skin. He saw the familiar, decaying backdrop of the plant that haunted his dreams. And then he heard the distorted voice of the chairman. "You were always too clever for your own good, Walsh. You have 30 minutes to bring the decryption keys to the old plant. If we see a single police light, the Titan legacy ends tonight with its last heiress." Walsh didn't hesitate. He didn't call the authorities. He knew the police in the city were just another line item on the Titan budget. He grabbed his heavy leather jacket and a bag of modified tools that looked more like weapons. His heart, which he had sworn was hardened against Rose, hammered with a desperate, primal rhythm. He knew it was a trap. He knew they intended to bury him in the ruins of his own past. But as he ignited the engine of his rusted truck, the roar of the exhaust sounded like a war cry. He had lost his career, his reputation, and his youth to the Titan family, but he refused to let them take the only person who had looked at the man behind the grease and seen a human being. He shifted into gear, the tires screaming against the pavement as he raced toward the place where his life had ended once, prepared to make sure it didn't end for Rose. The rusted tow truck screamed as Walsh threw it into fifth gear, but it was no longer the humble vehicle that had patrolled the highways. In the frantic minutes before reaching the plant, Walsh had stripped the limiters and engaged the experimental overdrive module hidden beneath the floorboards. The truck had become a kinetic weapon, its hydraulic boom reinforced with industrial steel and its front grille shielded by a makeshift cowcatcher capable of punching through reinforced concrete. As the skeletal silhouette of the Titan manufacturing plant loomed, Walsh didn't slow down. He saw the black sedans of the board's private security blocking the main entrance. He reached for a control panel he'd wired into the dash, flipping a series of toggles. "Let's see how you handle a dead signal," he gritted out. He activated a high-frequency localized jammer, the same tech he'd seen in Rose's Ferrari, instantly killing the engines and radios of the security team. Their cars went dark, dead in the water, as the tow truck thundered past them like a ghost of the industrial age. He slammed through the loading dock doors, the sound of rending metal echoing through the hollow cathedral of the plant. Inside, the chairman stood on a raised catwalk above Rose, his face twisting in terror as the truck skidded to a halt in a cloud of dust and burnt rubber. Security guards emerged from the shadows, raising sidearms, but Walsh was faster. He hit a lever, and the truck's rear-mounted work lights flared with a blinding, stroboscopic intensity, disorienting the gunman. Walsh stepped out of the cab, not with a gun, but with a pneumatic rivet driver and a heavy-duty wrench that looked like a warhammer in his grease-stained grip. He moved with a terrifying, calculated efficiency. When a guard lunged at him, Walsh didn't just fight, he dismantled. He used his knowledge of center of gravity and mechanical leverage to sweep legs and crush wrists, moving through the factory floor like a machine returning to its home. The chairman pulled a small detonator from his pocket, pointing it at the supports holding Rose's platform. "One more step, Walsh, and she drops into the crusher." Walsh froze, but his fingers were already dancing over the remote bypass unit in his palm. He had spent 10 years memorizing every bolt and wire in this building. "That detonator runs on a 433 MHz burst," Walsh said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "I jammed that frequency the moment I hit the parking lot. You're holding a plastic toy." To prove it, Walsh pressed a button on his remote. Instead of the explosion the chairman expected, the heavy industrial magnets above the catwalk surged to life. The metal railings and the chairman's own heavy watch were yanked upward with violent force, pinning the villain against the ceiling supports. Walsh sprinted up the stairs, his boots clanging on the metal. He reached Rose, his hands trembling as he sliced through her restraints with a pocket knife. As she fell into his arms, the ghost engineer didn't look like a legend or a hero. He looked like a man who had finally reclaimed the only thing the Titan family couldn't steal from him. "I've got you," he whispered against her hair, the mechanical war finally subsiding into the silence of the ruins. The sirens of the arriving authorities pulsed against the blackened windows of the plant, casting rhythmic flares of blue and red over the rusted machinery. One by one, the men who had built a throne out of betrayal were led away in shadows. The chairman, stripped of his dignity and pinned no longer by magnets but by the cold reality of handcuffs, wouldn't even look Walsh in the eye as he was marched past. The air in the factory, once heavy with the threat of death, now felt strangely light, as if the ghosts of the past had finally been exorcised. Rose stood by the open door of Walsh's battered truck, her silhouette framed by the morning's first light. She looked at the man who had spent his life in the dirt, only to rise and save her from the clouds. The weight of her name felt like a physical burden. "Walsh," she began, her voice barely a whisper in the cavernous space. "What my father did, what they all did to you, it's a debt I can never truly repay. But I'm asking you, for the sake of the people who still believe in what we can build, please, forgive my family. Help me turn Titan into what it was always meant to be." Walsh stood with his back to her, staring at the empty assembly line where his first prototype had once been dismantled. His shoulders, usually so broad and steady, suddenly hitched. When he turned around, Rose saw something she never expected from the man of iron and oil. Tears were carving clean tracks through the grease on his cheeks, reflecting the dawn. "You think I did this for the company?" Walsh asked, his voice cracking with a decade of suppressed pain. He took a step toward her, his hands, scarred and calloused, trembling at his sides. "I hated that name for 10 years. I hated every car that wore that badge. I didn't come here to save an empire, Rose. I came here because when I looked into your eyes on that highway, I didn't see a Titan. I saw a girl who deserved a chance to drive her own life. I didn't do it for them. I did it for you." The silence that followed was no longer filled with the ghosts of betrayal, but with a new, terrifying hope. Rose reached out, her clean fingers interlacing with his stained ones, bridging the gap between the penthouse and the pavement. "Then let's build something that isn't built on lies," she said firmly. "No more ghosts, Walsh. Just us." A small, weary smile touched Walsh's lips as he wiped his eyes with the back of a sleeve. He looked at the rusted truck and then at the shimmering potential of the future. He didn't need a boardroom or a billion-dollar budget to be a king. He just needed a partner who knew the value of the man behind the machine. Together, they walked out of the ruins, ready to restart the engine of a legacy that would finally, for the first time, be built to last. Thank you for watching and listening to this story. Hit the subscribe button as I will be bringing more interesting stories. Turn on your notification because you would not want to miss my story for anything.